Well, they did it. They put Ness Earthbound in a movie.
My character's official name, right here, it's Ness. And I was told by everyone that Scott specifically called out that he needed me to be named Ness. Like, oh, this gotta be a reference to Ness from FNAF AR. Or maybe this is another instance of Vanessa from Security Breach. You know, just Scott trolling people by using the same name over and over again. But no, when I met him later in the day, he told me it was a reference to Sans' Ness. He was very proud of himself.
Always knew Scott was a JRPG fan. This means the damn Five Nights at Freddy's movie had more acknowledgement of this series than the actual Nintendo movie that came out this year. But the thing about that you have to consider is that it was actually just a deep cut reference to how Nintendo never mentions the series. They were just being faithful. It's really amazing to me just how much of the intricate lore of the series is brought to life and taken very seriously in this movie, and yet there is no plot. To be honest, all they had to do to sell fans on this movie was make the animatronic characters look good, and that they did. These things are ridiculously accurate, and I do admire their dedication to their core audience. But as anything that isn't a Five Nights at Freddy's movie, this thing decays. To me, the biggest problem is that the movie just isn't scary, which wouldn't be a problem if this wasn't being marketed as a horror movie based on a survival horror video game. Like how the original game spawned a countless amount of copycat games, once the movie was announced, this also spawned preemptive copycats in the film industry. But these films' lack of understanding of what made the original game so unsettling led them in boring and phoned-in directions.
Hello?
But unlike most film adaptations of video games, this film actually stood a lot to gain from being more faithful to the gameplay elements. In many video game movies, the mechanics and setups are oftentimes shoehorned in for fans to gawk and overextend their jaws at.
Wait, how am I supposed to do that?
With the power-ups. They give us special abilities.
A great, maybe even fantastic groundwork for a film is there for this series, but in trying to pander to fans of the deep lore elements, they overlook the fantastic premise they had for a great genre film. Part of the reason Five Nights at Freddy's deeper elements took off so much were due to the fact that its premise is really simple. You're a security guard trying to survive the night in a showbiz pizza from homicidal animatronics. That's great, and it's all you need in terms of setting up a video game. By building these unseen, more complicated elements around that very basic concept, Scott was able to draw in a massive following, and in this, his approach was actually somewhat similar to the grandfathers of video games back in the 80s, in largely building the story around the mechanics. Now, movies obviously need a little bit more than that, but that's just great foundation. Okay, so now we're getting into some spoiler territory, so if you don't want this film spoiled for you, skip to this timestamp. Anyway, instead of focusing on the great premise of the first game, they decided to deep dive into the main character's psyche and PTSD for a large portion of the runtime. Now, character is obviously super important in creating a story with an emotional connection, but this is again where the movie detracts from what works about it. They try to make you feel bad for this character due to his traumatic past and current family disputes, but the reason we should be caring about him is the fact that killer animatronics are trying to stuff him in a suit. That guttural human struggle just to survive is all you need for a compelling horror movie like this. I've talked about internal frustration before, that feeling of being somewhat agitated by things in a story because you feel an urge to intervene to stop the conflict, and that's what you'd have if the film was more faithful to the gameplay. And boom, you have an engaging movie. But they flubbed this by trying to have their cake and eat it too. Oh, they're actually not bad guys, they just kill bad people. Because they want people to like these characters so they'll buy more merchandise as the film series expands. But the thing is, numerous horror icons became massively marketable and very profitable despite being bad guys. It's partly what makes the idea of horror as a genre so attractive to freaks like me. You get to dabble in a bit of moral mischief where you can simultaneously fear these creatures while occasionally still cheering for them. So instead of a simple survival story, we get a slower drama film. Now, drama is important, but this level of exposition and world building just isn't warranted for a single film. There's a reason it was all introduced into the games gradually with time, and seeing as it appears the plan has been to churn out sequels if this one did well, there's no reason some of this couldn't have waited a bit in favor of the more important elements to this film. What this movie really should have been is a horror version of Night at the Museum, with the main character slowly getting better and better at his jobs as the nights went by, with some good enough justification for why he keeps coming back. Honestly, the film could have even taken a cue from Willy's Wonderland and left the character's backstory much more open, and if they really wanted to get artsy, even make the film first person, like Hardcore Henry or something, so it'd be even more like the games. But instead we get a boring lore dump of a movie where we're completely robbed of even a single night of the main character actually having to survive on his own, and realizing everything happening around him, making the first several nights drastically easier for him than in the game. If you're a fan of this series, you might be somewhat satisfied with the film, but I can't help but think it had a lot of its potential wasted. The zeitgeist of the series would have never taken off if it wasn't for its excellent ability to make the player feel dread while playing it. And yeah, I think another big problem is how early they just show the animatronics moving around. Really should have been a slower reveal with him looking between cameras when he starts to notice and gets all freaked out. I'm not a lore aficionado of this series, so I'm not overly familiar with many of the more subtle details that are in the film, but I do still appreciate the filmmakers' dedication in trying to please the fans, as hit and miss as they were with it. And who knows, maybe the sequel will do what this one failed at: make the horror the real star instead of the games.
It's just a theory.
Are you being paid by the word, or could we have a minute?